Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Scott Allen Miller. Today on Sam IT, we're going to take a historical look at how IT was in the 1990s and look into the question of why 1998 was such a pivotal year for IT, and especially for Microsoft. So it's a little bit hard looking back now after nearly 20 years to understand exactly what was going on in the late 1990s. But the IT field pretty much didn't exist in the 1980s. It was only in the early 1990s that the concept of IT and organizations really started to take hold. Prior to this point, we certainly had computers, but we mostly had people who just operated and used computers, and computers were often either installed by vendors or installed very simply without networking, and they were more of just end-user devices and less combined into a single organizational information infrastructure. So as a concept, IT was effectively new somewhere around the very late 80s to the very early 90s, and it was not well defined. No one knew what the roles were, no one knew what the technologies were, and things were changing rapidly. There was very little standardization. People weren't even close by the mid-1990s of determining what networking technologies were going to be taking off. There were three major high-level networking technology stacks that were being considered for individual businesses. These included NetBEUI from the Microsoft camp, IPX/SPX from the Novell camp, and TCP/IP from the government. And at the time, it looked like IPX/SPX was going to be the big winner, and at the time it was winning, but the others were getting some traction. NetBEUI was specifically popular because it was so easy to use that at the time, the idea that people needed to know about networking, while accepted, was very difficult. People struggled trying to figure out how to do basic networking tasks, things that we assume end users would do trivially today. So that was a big factor. Computers were very new and very varied, and even networking technologies like Ethernet hadn't taken root yet, and while Ethernet was around, we were dealing with things like ThickNet and ThinNet and vampire taps. Simple things like just plugging in a computer didn't exist. Getting a computer onto the network could be very difficult, and believe it or not, people were still using, and what a vampire tap literally was, it was a little device with a channel, and you put a little thing came down, and you twisted a screw, and it would go through the cable until it actually tapped into the copper. Obviously not great for electrical transmission, not great for being able to take machines on and off the network, and just silly. Overall, just a ridiculous way to do things, and yet that was a very standard way of plugging things in. Ethernet was nowhere close to being dominant yet, and they were still looking at technologies like Token Ring, which were incredibly complex to understand. If one device went off the network, the entire network would go down. The connectors used giant hermaphrodite connectors that were about this big. It's hard to see, but they were about 2 inches or more in size, huge square things with giant blocks on the wall. You ka-chung, and you'd plug into the wall, and it was just ridiculous. Working with it was really, really hard. And these were the better technologies at the time. Lots of different things were being considered, and even once you got onto one of these networks, again, you didn't have TCP/IP, so you were using who knew what different product on top of that, and getting your computers to talk to each other was very difficult. And so things like, I have a Mac, you have a PC, today, of course they talk to each other, they share files, they share everything, but back then they actually couldn't talk to each other. They used different encoding structures on the network, different encoding structures on disk, all kinds of things. Communications between machines didn't happen. By the early 1990s, we started to get some of what we would recognize as modern IT technologies that we use today. 1991 saw the beginning of Linux, but it was very early and certainly unusable at the time. And by 1993, we started to have Windows NT, but it looked like the old Windows from the 80s, and it wasn't until 1995 that we got Windows 95, which was not a business tool, and Windows NT 4 in 1996, and these brought kind of the modern look and feel, things that we would recognize today as basically modern systems, just very early ones, began to arise. This gave us a few years to get traction, some things started to solidify, and around 1998, a bunch of magic things simply fell together. One was Microsoft overtook Novell and became the dominant force in the end user space. Apple Macintosh was still a major competitor. Sun Microsystems was still a major competitor. Lots of players were still in there vying for dominance, but Microsoft really had come out on top. Their technology was far easier and more robust than Novell's had been, and Novell had failed to keep pace. Novell, up until this point, had been leading by such a margin, people thought they were simply going to dominate the field for a very long time. In doing this, IPX SPX, which was promoted by Novell, fell by the wayside pretty quickly, and Novell had to adapt to Microsoft's chosen technology of TCP/IP, which they were getting from the Unix world, which was promoting that pretty heavily. Microsoft had, remember, been promoting NetBEUI, but they gave up and moved over to TCP/IP, and that decision to just give in and go with what Unix was doing broadly meant that they were able to join the internet revolution, because prior to that, company networks weren't on the internet and weren't really able to go on the internet, which is a big deal. If you're on a NetBEUI or an IPX SPX network, connecting to the internet was essentially impossible. You could make gateways, but it was really complex because you had to have gateways and go between completely different types of networks. Both from a technology standpoint and a management standpoint, this was a mess. So Microsoft going with TCP/IP and being able to talk to Unix servers was a leap forward. About the same time, Ethernet made some big leaps forward. It wasn't up to switched yet, but it was using Cat5, and it was using hubs where you could actually plug in instead of doing all kinds of weird, complicated things with, like, trunk cables, bus cables going through the building and tapping into them or whatever. Ethernet suddenly became very easy to use, and so around this time, Ethernet and Windows and a number of Unix systems kind of came into their own, and Microsoft and Novell and a couple others pushed really, really hard right about this time to develop these really strong certification curriculums and certification paths that became very well known in the industry right about the same time. And just a whole bunch of things came together, and CompTIA started doing their certifications, and you started to get the very first hint of IT programs in universities. And with all of these things coming together, we took a leap from this completely fragmented early 1990s world to having a very solid, still somewhat fragmented, but a pretty good picture of what the future of IT was going to look like. The idea that you were going to have a LAN that would connect to the internet was now accepted. Windows 98 came out, and Windows NT had become very mature. It had come out with a lot of service packs and was now seen as a very viable product. It now had Internet Explorer 3. Mozilla was starting to come out and compete. We started to get real solid internet services from Alta Vista and companies like that. Google and Amazon were just starting to really get to be known just a little bit. I mean, they weren't super popular, but they were starting to become real viable companies. And people started to accept the fact that they were going to be online, and that their businesses were going to run on computers, and those computers were going to be on a network, and that even if they didn't have it at that time, that they were within some short period of time going to be on the internet. They were still almost always dial-up internet at the time, but we could see broadband and baseband technologies coming. They were just very expensive, and we knew that they were going to be a few years away. But 1998 ended up being just this perfect kind of culmination of all these changes, and they hit at about the same time that Microsoft really came into their own, and Microsoft exploded in those years and really went from, and this is hard to believe today, that they weren't that big of a player in 1997. They were certainly important, and everyone knew their name. But they went from, in 1997, being I wonder how Microsoft's going to fare with all these changes going on, to in 1998 being, Microsoft is now the leading contender for a single entity within the single business space. And they were doing things like Windows NT authentication, which now we have Active Directory, which didn't actually come out for another couple of years, but we had the forerunner of it, which was still robust and very powerful at the time. Of course, at the same time, Linux came up, and by around 1997 was a very strong competitor with Windows and had a very important place in the industry. But it wasn't obviously in the place that it is today, and certainly not where Microsoft was in 1998. But because it was Linux and it was coming into a spot where it became a major player in the industry, it helped solidify 1998 as the year that things kind of came together, because Linux still remains today the dominant operating system player across the board. Now, in 1998, Mac was still on Mac OS 9. They had not gone to X or 10 yet. That was going to be announced in later 1999. And so Apple actually was really in a difficult position in the late 1990s. It was incredibly antiquated and it couldn't play with everyone else. So this is kind of where they fell by the wayside. And since then, they've done very well since their announcement of OS X or OS X, whatever you want to call it, in late 1999 and the release in early 2000. They've come a very long way and are a major force today. But at the time, they didn't get to play a very big role in defining what IT was going to look like. They looked like they weren't even going to be around for very long. And while they've recovered, that is an important piece in shaping how IT looks today, because the players like Microsoft and the Linux distributions really had a huge role in giving us the future of the industry, and their vision is what we pretty much live with today. So that kind of explains what happened to make 1998 the perfect storm that simply made it the year that modern IT solidified. And so because more than anything, I believe that it was Microsoft who put those pieces together at the time, and most importantly, built the most important certification curriculum of the time, that educational underpinning became, even for people who didn't use Microsoft products later, it became a guiding force in conveying the information that people were going to need and use in the field. And so people who were educated during that period primarily were done so with the Microsoft Vision, and they, over the generations since, the professional generations, not the human generations, have then taught their juniors and their interns or whatever, the people who work for them, they've passed on the information from that era. And so what was codified in 1998 has become reiterated generation after generation, and we still find so much of what we gathered as far as best practices and approaches and thought processes around how IT was going to be come from that era. And today, of course, we struggle because we're coming up on 20 years and it is time for a lot of those things to be reconsidered. And it's not to say that they were wrong in 1998. Microsoft did an amazing job of codifying some really important things in 1998, but there's two problems. One is that that was 20 years ago and a lot has changed. And two is that a lot of the things that they taught that were very, very good in 1998 were repeated, instead of being repeated correctly, as in Microsoft giving a bunch of factors and helping people understand what they should know. A lot of answers from that were kind of memorized by rote and passed on as rote, and that gives us a Chinese telephone effect where, one, rote memorization is always wrong, right? It's okay for memorizing the date of the defeat of the Spanish Armada, but it's not okay for memorizing what RAID level you should use for your RAID array, because the factors underneath change over time. And rote memorization, when passed on from person to person over generations, deteriorates, and the information that may have been correct at the beginning may not even be what's being repeated later, and eventually that information becomes completely useless, even if it didn't become outdated. And at this point, 20 years later, we're facing the fact that it is both outdated and based on information that is no longer complete, and it has been repeated inaccurately generation after generation, so there's just a lot of misinformation out there. It's time for a bit of an educational revolution, but we have to look back and thank Microsoft for giving us a really amazing foundation to the industry from around 1998, and we couldn't have gotten to where we have today without them. If you went back and looked at what they did at the time, they actually did a really excellent job. They are certainly not to blame for how they've been misrepresented over the years. Thanks for joining me. I hope this little bit of history was educational and interesting. Remember to like and subscribe, and as always, sponsorship on Patreon can go a long way to helping us be able to make these videos for you in the future and bring you more educational and historical content from the field of IT. Thanks for joining me. This episode of Sam IT has been sponsored by our friends at Talkadillo, the affordable, simple, fully managed, predictably priced VoIP PBX platform. Learn more at talkadillo.com and help to support Sam IT.